I mean, the two biggest stories of 2020, the once-in-a-century pandemic and the national referendum on Donald Trump, will converge in full view of the world tomorrow. And it will happen at a time when the country is arguably in the worst phase of virus transmission, while the president is doing the worst job he's ever done on it, which is saying something. Writer Rebecca Traister recently explored both these topics in a piece for New York Magazine's The Cut titled Wide Awake, while New Yorker staff writer Jelani Cobb spent a year examining the implications vote suppression will have on this election in a frontline documentary titled Whose Vote Counts, and they both join me now. You know, the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life covering politics, in my adult life, which I've been covering politics more or less full-time since I was about 22 years old, is the fact that the president's approval rating and the head-to-head matchups with Joe Biden are essentially unchanged from the before times. Before a mysterious respiratory infection started to make its way around Wuhan, out of the fish market and through Hubei province, and crept over the country and changed all of our lives so that I'm talking to you now on Zoom and on FaceTime, and you're living in different places, and our kids aren't going to school, and there's 20 million people on unemployment and 230,000 dead, and all that's happened, and it's all the same, and it just drives a stake through my head. But at the same time, I think it also probably contributes to the fact the president right now is not favored to win. How do you understand that central fact, Rebecca?
Well, in some ways, I understand it as being reflective of the fact that even prior to this completely universe-altering pandemic, the feelings about Donald Trump were pretty cemented, right? It's not like his presidency had been going great up until March.
Correct.
And there was so much, you know, the past 4 years have been a period of so much political engagement and activation amongst people who had not previously been activists. And people felt very strongly how they felt about Trump, about politics, about their participation in this process, and that was all in advance of the pandemic. Now, does that explain how what I understand to be his gross and malevolent mismanagement of that pandemic didn't actually erode more of his very steadfast and unwavering support? I can't totally explain that. But I do think it's that the way in which Trump and his administration and his party have responded ineptly, irresponsibly, murderously to the pandemic is not at odds with how they had been governing previous to the pandemic.
It's a great point that essentially, I mean, one of the themes on this show from the first day that he became president was that there was a very high likelihood of catastrophe because of who he is and how he was governing, and that we were all playing collectively a kind of game of Russian roulette. And just if the chamber was empty over and over again, it didn't mean that we had gotten away safe. Jelani, you've been looking at the question of voter suppression, which I think intersects in interesting ways with the pandemic, because obviously these efforts made at the state level to change the way people vote are because of taking seriously both the virus and people's concerns over it. And there's still going to be tens of millions of people out there voting tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, and so I think that ties Rebecca's point, to this issue of voter suppression too, which is to say that, this candidacy was never about policy or about ideas. It was about who Trump is and what Trump is, and the fact that people identified with that for whatever reasons that were, whatever cultural or antagonistic or racial or bigoted or any of those kinds of things, the kind of ball of, deplorable things that he brought to the table and people identified with. And then at the same token, if you're running a campaign that is contingent upon the support of those people, knowing that you will alienate lots of people in the middle and certainly not get any votes from people who are on the other side, the only way that you can win is to minimize the voter returns of your opponents. And that's what we've seen. And quite frankly, Trump takes the blame for this, but all he is doing is accelerating and being much more overt about what has been a Republican playbook, what has been in the Republican playbook for years now.
And it is the explicit 44% strategy, right? Or a 45% strategy, or 46% strategy, which is, in most cases, not enough to win. It's not enough to govern. He was able to be elected president from that position, has never increased it. And at the same time, we're now on the eve of the culmination of tremendous amount of political work that has been done. Rebecca, you had a great piece about this. I mean, just from the Women's March on, I'd like to hear you both sort of talk about the amount of activation, the amount of organizing, the amount of work that has done by many millions of just fellow Americans to bring us to a point in which there's the possibility of this kind of pro-democracy majority repudiating what we've seen. What's your feeling about that as we're on that threshold, Rebecca?
So I think that what's happened in this 4 years has been really powerful on that front. And I want to be clear, a lot of the activism extends well before. Its roots are in the Obama administration and in some cases the Bush administration. Certainly Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, Occupy, all that was an Obama administration sort of development of protest. But the masses flooding the streets, as they did with the Women's March on the first day of Donald Trump's inauguration, as they did a week later in going to airport protests in response to the Muslim ban, protesting gun violence after the Parkland shootings, certainly this summer, and people taking to the streets in more than 2,200 cities and towns around this country to proclaim that Black Lives Matter. We've been in this period of mass protests that I think is pretty unprecedented, but I want to point out that the words you used, which is, because it's not exactly a left policy set of protests, right? It's so big that it's sort of more dilute than that. It is pro-democracy. And one of the things that Jelani's work is so clear on, and that is so clear in these days leading up to the election, is that the fight is for democracy. It's for the ability to vote. And I've never seen, in fact, in response to these masses out suddenly in ways that are pretty unprecedented, what you're seeing is a lockdown on minority rule and open defense of minority rule. Open pride in trying to suppress the vote. Open lawsuits saying we don't want these 100,000 votes in Harris County that were cast legally counted. Somebody like Senator Mike Lee saying democracy itself is a problem. A Republican gubernatorial candidate in Washington State, Lauren Culp, saying the same thing. Republicans actually repudiating the very notion of democracy in response to a set of mass movements and to mass engagement in politics. And what you can see is the opposition party not just replying in opposition to ideas or policies, but actually in opposition to the notion of democracy itself.
And Jelani, that's why tomorrow feels so monumental. Its stakes seem impossible, frankly, for me to articulate, and because something essential about the nature of the country we live in really seems up for grabs.
Listen, 1,455. That's the number of days since the last election. People have had this in mind, like the finish line in a marathon, an ultra marathon. And, to Rebecca's point, I think she just really made this very clear and very plain that, we understand this. So people who look at the history of this country, we understand this cyclically. And, while, the administration and various people on the right have attacked the 1619 Project for wanting to tear America down, for talking about the racist history that has been present in the country since its founding, it is too benighted a perspective to understand that what we're actually trying to do is point out the contours of the failures of democracy. These are America's vulnerabilities.
Yes. Yeah.
These are the things that America has to address if it actually wants to be what it proclaims itself to be, which is the benchmark for democracy in the world. And it's not a secret. Why do we think it is that Vladimir Putin and the Russian bots that was such a factor in 2016 targeted African Americans and targeted whites and tried to widen the gap, the chasm of racial animosity, because they know that is the way that you undermine the country. And we have a president who has consistently gone further and further down the road of widening that chasm. And so this is what is essentially at stake. It's not simply a matter of progress or matter of particular policy prerogatives. It is a matter of the extent of America's ability to actually refer to itself as a democracy and not be telling a lie.
And that is what is on the ballot. It has been on the ballot. It will be on the ballot tomorrow. If you're watching this right now and you haven't voted yet, please go vote tomorrow. Take a mask and make some time if you can. Rebecca Traister and Jelani Cobb, it is always great to talk to you both. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, well, that is all in on this Monday night. I love my country. I know you watching this do too, and I'm rooting for it. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.